Most histories of King Kong begin with the narrative of Miriam C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack's adventures in far-flung lands filming documentaries like Grass and Chang. And they talk about Willis O'Brien's masterpiece, The Lost World, and his ill-fated follow-up, Creation. And they mention The Most Dangerous Game, whose budget built the jungle sets for King Kong and kept leads Fay Wray and Robert Armstrong on retainer. But there is another movie that sometimes gets a line, maybe a footnote, but which had a huge impact on King Kong, both in front and behind the camera. RKO's 1932 picture Bird of Paradise was the high point of the South Seas island genre, whose effects rippled through King Kong, and it starred the gorgeous Mexican ingenue, Dolores Del Rio. The United States has had a long and complex history with the Pacific. Its most well-known expression is tiki culture, the fantasy world of thatch-roofed bars, Hawaiian shirts, and whimsical ceramic mugs that developed in the wake of World War II, when American soldiers who had served in the Pacific theater reminisced of faraway beaches and palm trees while simultaneously enjoying an unparalleled economic boom. Americans had already been primed by Polynesian exotica for several decades before World War II, however. To make a long story short, after numerous encroachments by European and American imperialists, a committee of American plantation owners staged an outright coup against the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893. Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1897, and from the turn of the century onward, the newly minted territory of Hawaii became a tourist spot as hot as the volcanic features that formed it. But what of those people who dreamt of faraway, scented isles, but didn't have the money to take the Matson Line's luxurious ocean liners, or Pan American's majestic flying boats, let alone staying in glorious hotels like the Pink Palace of the Pacific, the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, on the shores of Waikiki Beach? For the less affluent masses of Middle America, their main acquaintance with Hawaii would not have come from traveling there, but from the radio programs broadcast from the ballrooms of these grand hotels, traveling hula shows at state fairs, tropical supper clubs that would become the first tiki pioneers, and the flickering images of the silver screen. 30 years before Elvis went blue Hawaii, Bing Crosby crooned the song in his film Waikiki Wedding. Harry Owens and his Royal Hawaiians, who performed the radio program Hawaii Calls from 1934 to 1975 from the ballroom of the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, also performed for Betty Grable and Victor Mature in Song of the Islands in 1942. Hawaii Calls itself became a film produced by RKO in 1938. 1939's Honolulu transplanted Mark Twain's story The Prince and the Pauper to Hawaii and spiced it up with the comedy of George Burns and Gracie Allen, as well as the dancing of Eleanor Powell. 1935's Mutiny on the Bounty retold one of the most exciting episodes of seafaring, starring Charles Laughton as Captain Bligh and Clark Gable as Fletcher Christian. Joan Crawford looked at the dark side of the tropics in 1932's Rain, as did Leslie Howard in 1931's Never the Twain Shall Meet. The latter was directed by W.S. Van Dyke, who had previously filmed The Pagan and White Shadows in the South Seas during the silent era. Other silent era South Seas films included F.W. Murnau's Taboo, A Story of the South Seas, Robert Flaherty's documentary Moana, and Hula starring Clara Bow. Abbott and Costello had a laugh at the whole genre with 1942's Pardon My Sarong. This is only a small sample of an expansive genre. The most archetypal of these films was 1932's Bird of Paradise, a lavish, over-budget production released by RKO, produced by David O. Selznick, directed by King Vidor, starring Dolores Del Rio and Joel McCrea, based on a 1912 stage play of the same name. Maria de los Dolores Asunsolo y Lopez Negrete, known professionally as Dolores Del Rio, was already a breakout Latina star when she came to RKO in 1932. Along with Fay Wray and Joan Crawford, she had been dubbed one of the Western Association of Motion Picture Advertisers' baby stars of 1926, a high distinction of being one of the future actors to look out for. She had 14 silent films under the belt, culminating in the title role of 1929's Evangeline, an adaptation of Longfellow's poem about Canada's Acadian expulsion. Her first sound film was The Bad One for United Artists in 1930, and in 1932 she signed on to 3 films for RKO. The first of her films was an unremarkable melodrama called Girl of the Rio, which was also the start of RKO's attempts to make the title of the film a pun on her stage name. In it, Del Rio plays Dolores Romero, a performer in a Mexican cantina who suffers the unwanted advances of the loathsome landowner Don Jose Tostado. Sadly, the direction and cinematography of Girl of the Rio is pedestrian, and the acting mostly maudlin. The only real high point is Del Rio herself, stunningly beautiful, and with serious enough acting chops and screen presence to stand out in an otherwise uninspired picture. Her final speech, to finally stand up against her abuser, practically leaps off the screen. Though a luminescent high point in Girl of the Rio, Del Rio suffers from almost baffling directorial choices in Bird of Paradise. All films in the genre that didn't strive for documentary verisimilitude, and many that did, were nevertheless a foreign, American gaze upon cultures of whom they had a limited understanding. The South Seas represented exotic fascination, to be sure, and many of these films center on the fantasy of a white man or woman running off to a perceived paradise of cultural and sexual liberation. Yet it is also a paternalistic gaze, a facile, reductive, and often racist view of complex Polynesian societies as things, quote, primitive and superstitious, savage and yet naive and childlike, end quote. As a consequence, Del Rio overdoes it by leaps and bounds. She is very loud, still delivering a clipped, fake babble language with a Spanish accent, and excessively exuberant to the point of irritation. Had Vidor told her to dial it back a little, it would have been a much better performance overall. It is difficult to get invested in the pathos when she is practically clowning the rest of the time. Nevertheless, Del Rio's physical attributes were certainly taken advantage of. 1932 was before the enforcement of the Hays Code, and Bird of Paradise certainly pushed the limits. Several times, Del Rio's modesty is protected only by a well-placed lei, and Orson Welles called her nearly nude swimming scene the highest erotic ideal. Even with her bug eyes and mugging, it's difficult not to see what Joel McCrea's character saw in her. The story itself is a simple trope, culminating with the girl in the volcano. After his yacht of dilettantes visits an unnamed Pacific island inferred to be part of the Hawaiian archipelago, Joel McCrea falls in love with the chief's daughter and chooses to stay behind. Unfortunately for them both, she is taboo. That is, she is consecrated to the volcano goddess Pele, and therefore it is unlawful for any man to touch her. It's not about to stop a red-blooded American, and he interrupts the ceremony to flee with her to an abandoned coast. But this idyllic meeting of cultures cannot last, spiraling towards a tragic conclusion. Though South Seas films drew upon a fascination with exotic cultures, they regularly ended up affirming the incompatibility of Western civilization with those cultures, whether because of the perceived primacy of Western civilization or because Western civilization is the snake in Eden. Due to prior film commitments, neither Del Rio nor McCrea were able to join the filming on location in Hawaii. South Seas Pictures were a mixed bag of geographic authenticity. Bird of Paradise was in the rare class that actually was filmed, in whole or at least in part, in the Isles of Hawaii and Tahiti. Often, productions stayed a little closer to Hollywood. The most popular South Seas island in cinema is Catalina Island, about 35 kilometers off the coast of Los Angeles. It doubled for Skull Island in Son of Kong, and Tahiti and Pitcairn Island in Mutiny on the Bounty. A speakeasy built for the crew of Mutiny on the Bounty remained behind to become an early pre-tiki bar called Christian's Hut, which also housed Clark Gable's upstairs penthouse when he was on the island. One of its bartenders, Ray Buin, went on to found Tiki Tea, one of Los Angeles' oldest extant tiki bars. Most productions just stayed in Hollywood, though, using sound stages and backlots and rear projection to replicate island paradises. It's pretty easy to tell which is which in Bird of Paradise. The expansive shots of ocean and island are on location. Dark and intimate scenes between our leads were in Hollywood. Busby Berkeley went uncredited as the choreographer for the native dance scenes, also shot on a Hollywood soundstage. But this lack of authenticity had an ancillary benefit. One of the cost-saving measures for King Kong was to reuse the village huts from Bird of Paradise for the village on Skull Island. But Bird of Paradise is also why King Kong needed to cut costs. All of this shooting across the Pacific, dance numbers, building a native village, and having one of cinema's first complete orchestral scores provided by Max Steiner took its toll on the budget. In the final tally, Bird of Paradise cost $752,000. After accounting for the marketing budget, it lost $250,000 at the box office, a catastrophic failure for an already indebted company like RKO. In 1933, RKO would go into receivership. Part of its recovery strategy was to strictly enforce a $250,000 budget cap on films, which wasn't nearly enough for Kong. Thanks to Bird of Paradise, Merian C. Cooper had to get creative with the accounting and eke out ways for other films' budgets, like Most Dangerous Game, to pay for Kong. For her part, Dolores Del Rio went on to star in Flying Down to Rio, a musical in which she got to play a sophisticated Brazilian aristocrat caught in a love triangle between the American band leader she falls in love with and the wealthy Brazilian bachelor to whom her hand has been arranged, who also happens to be the best friend of the American band leader. Furthermore, there is a plot to cause the financial ruin of her father's new hotel, for whom the American band is playing. But where Bird of Paradise ends in tragedy, Flying Down to Rio ends in one of the most memorable scenes in cinema history. Since the hotel has been barred from having performers, why not put the dancing girls on the wings of airplanes flying over Rio de Janeiro? It's all done with special effects, of course, but it is a highly inventive musical number nonetheless. Del Rio is much more tolerable in this film. She's allowed to act more naturally, and it shows. This would be her last film for RKO, however. The company opted against renewing her contract due to financial concerns, and she went on to a long career that included an affair with Orson Welles and a brief return to RKO for his film Journey into Fear. At RKO, and in general, her career was well and truly eclipsed by a pair of supporting actors from Flying Down to Rio. They were given 4th and 5th billing, and only had one dance number together. But by the time they finished the karaoke, they would become the biggest stars at RKO. In the next installment, we're going to take a look at the golden age of Hollywood musicals and the remarkable talent of RKO's other iconic duo, Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire.